Thank you, David. You'll notice, David, I wore a tie in your honor. David is noted for his sartorial elegance, which puts every other faculty member in Noisy to shame. When I realized that David was going to be introducing me, I realized that this was the nightmare scenario for any speaker, because following up David is impossible. So it's all downhill from here on. But thank you, David, for that very moving introduction. I really appreciate it. Let me just express my appreciation to everybody who's here, and because my work over many years has fed off, been inspired by the practice of many people who are in this room today and other people internationally who have inspired me. But I'd like to mention initially the organizers of this conference, or the main organizers, Antoinette, Ja, Paula, and Lyle. This is the star conference, not only in Canada, but across the world. There's no conference over the last 12 years that comes close to this, and I think you've done amazing work. So thank you for all the work that you have done over many years. I'd also like to express my appreciation to the many educators, and many of you are in the auditorium here, who've generously invited me into your classrooms and allowed me to marvel at your practice and sharing your insights. As I said, this is what I feed off. This is what is inspiring for me, and I thank you all for that. I'd also like to thank colleagues and graduate students at OISE and other universities across Canada and around the world for including me in the vibrant learning communities that you've created. And then finally, words can't express the debt that I owe to my family for supporting me and enabling me to pursue the academic work I've done over the last 30 years. So let me just talk about how I see my role and work. In a book I wrote back in 2000, the initial introductory section was called Theory as Dialogue. And this expresses how I see the work that I've done. And I'll quote you a couple of paragraphs from this. I said, I see the relationship between theory and practice as two-way and ongoing. Practice generates theory, which in turn acts as a catalyst for new directions in practice, which then inform theory and so on. So it's a cyclical process. It's not a hierarchical process. And sometimes, policymakers and others will say, and media commentators will say, well, it's just theory. Well, theory is fused with practice. You cannot separate the two. They're infused within each other. I went on to try and say research provides a lens through which practice can be seen and brought into focus for particular purposes and in particular contexts. So policymakers interpret the research findings and set guidelines for practice on the basis of both the research and sociopolitical and fiscal realities. So research is only one element that goes into the policymaking process, but most policymakers like to say that their policies are evidence-based. And I think we're fortunate in this province that over the last 10 years or so, we've had a government that has put education at the top of the agenda for the most part, and has seriously attempted to improve schooling for all children. At the same time, I think there are gaps in provision. And as the title of my presentation suggests, I want to suggest ways in which we can move forward from where we are. So what I'm trying to say here is that both insider and outsider perspectives are essential for understanding what's happening in schools and classrooms. And dialogue is essential to bring together the insights of educators with what's observed from outside by researchers. And I see my role and that of colleagues has been to act as a link or as a dialogical node. I didn't say dialogical nerd, but that might be seen also. But as a dialogical node to foster communication about what works instructionally for diverse groups of students. We need to aim not just for effective pedagogy, but for inspirational pedagogy. Because inspirational pedagogy is happening. If you go up to the exhibit on the 5th floor, the Imaginings exhibit that Saskia Still and other colleagues from around the province have put together, you'll see inspirational pedagogy in action. And we know it is happening. And we know that all children deserve to experience it, not just the children of economically privileged groups. And so the issue is, how can we ramp up? How can we make inspirational pedagogy accessible to all students? So I'd like to just go through very quickly some themes and episodes that turn on a light for me, and I'll just summarize the ones that I'm going to talk about briefly initially. One of the turning points for me was shortly after I came to OISE. I was at the Tesla Ontario conference, I think it was 1978, and Mary Ashworth was giving the closing keynote. And it was standing room only. I was a fly in the wall. I, as usual, arrived too late to get a seat. But what she said inspired me, and I'll share that with you in a moment. Another theme that's run through work that I've done is that the instructional implications of the fact that children's first language is a positive force in children's academic development. And what are those instructional implications? We know that it acts as a cognitive resource, it acts as a personal resource when its development is encouraged in school. And so how can we teach through a multilingual lens in ways that foster this development? And I'll suggest some ways. On the handout that I hope most of you have got, there's a couple of pages just quickly put together of very simple, no-cost ways in which we can shift our mindset so that we're teaching through a multilingual lens. Another issue that obviously has been talked about at this conference is the emergence of the distinction that I made between basic interpersonal communicative skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. And a clear implication of this is that ESL is everybody's business. And that phrase comes from a book that was written by two Toronto board educators, Fran Parkin and Felicity Sidnall, in the early 90s. And I'll talk more about that in a moment also. Another theme that I want to touch on is the centrality of literacy engagement. What the research is saying is that if we look at the intersection between access to print and students' achievement, and the fact that many students coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have much less access to print in their homes, and sometimes in places like the United States in their schools, than children from more privileged backgrounds. But what the research is suggesting is that if we get students engaged actively with literacy from the first day they arrive in school, we can push back about 1/3 of the negative effects of socioeconomic status. And we know this from the research. And in Canada, I think we're fortunate that we've never strayed too far away from a balanced approach to literacy, unlike our colleagues down in the United States. But I haven't seen any mainstream textbook, any of the gurus of educational change highlight the fact that literacy engagement is crucial. And that means that everybody should be reading David's books. He didn't ask me to say that. The research on this issue has huge implications. It means that teacher librarians are important people. Okay? They should not be the first ones that go when budget crunches come. Another theme that has infused much of what I've done over the last 20 or 30 years is the role of societal power relations. And I've made a distinction between coercive and collaborative relations of power. They're manifested in teacher-student identity negotiations. And this is a theme that from the mid-1980s to currently I've tried to highlight. And so what this is trying to say is that the interactions that we orchestrate in school are directly connected to broader societal trends, both historical and current, in terms of the intersections, the interrelationships between different communities and different ethnic groups. And finally, with Margaret Earley and other colleagues here in OISE and elsewhere, I've tried to highlight the concrete ways in which educators can address issues of unequal power relations. And one construct that I'll talk a little bit about is the notion of identity text, which again, we've heard a lot of in this conference, and we'll see many examples of them on the 5th floor in the Imaginings exhibit. So let me just go to Mary Ashworth's work and what she said many years ago. For those of you who don't know, Mary Ashworth was kind of the godmother of ESL in Canada. She wrote many lucid, inspirational books. She was just a pleasure to listen to, a pleasure to interact with, and was inspirational, certainly to me and I think to many other people. She worked at the University of British Columbia for many years. Mary made the point that many students come to school either already bilingual in their home language and English, or in the process of becoming bilingual. However, 12 years later, a large proportion of these students leave school essentially monolingual in English. And she said that the whole point of education is to make students more than they were when they entered school. But when the message bilingual children receive in school causes them to replace their first language with English, education has made them less than they were. She said the very essence of the term education, the nurturing of students' abilities and talents, was negated by the education they received in Canadian schools. Now, for me, this was a startling and disturbing insight, because Mary was talking about the Canadian educational system, which at that time was busy wrapping itself in the cloak of multiculturalism. The idea that Canadian schools and educators could be agents or complicit in the reduction of students' potential and the construction of possibilities, whether inadvertently or intentionally, was very provocative. But Mary's point was that as educators, we have the power to challenge these discriminatory structures and discourses and expand rather than constrict students' identities. And let me just give you an example of what Mary was talking about. And this example comes from the Multiliteracies project, which Margaret Early and I were engaged in about 10 years ago. This is a reflection of a student who's in Parminder Sandhu's grade 4 class. Parminder's here at this conference. And Parminder opened up the space in a classroom to get students to talk about language and how they felt about their first language. And she was working in a school that was highly multicultural, a school that was doing many, many good things. But looking at linguistic diversity had not been part of the agenda. And this student, who was from a Cantonese-speaking background, reflected in this way. She said, "I'm not always comfortable speaking Cantonese when I have to go to the office for some reason. I don't like it because a lot of teachers are at the office and I don't like speaking it in front of them. I know that they're listening to me. I get nervous and afraid. For example, once I didn't feel very well in grade 1, so my teacher took me to the office to call my grandma. My grandma can't speak English, and she also can't hear very well, so I had to speak in Cantonese very loudly for her to hear. So when I spoke to my grandma, I felt very nervous." Now, the secretaries in the office, any teachers that might be there, would have had no problems with this student speaking in Cantonese. And yet somehow she has internalized the fact that school is an English-only zone, and that other languages are not legitimate in this zone. And so there are subtle things happening in schools that are reducing the status of students' languages in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. We can do something about this. This is a photograph from Parminder's classroom, where the first thing you see when you go into the classroom is a poster or a bulletin board with the title, "All Our Languages in Our School." And I can remember vividly going into the class and 2 students just grabbing me. Luckily, I only had 2 arms because if I had more, there would have been many. They were so excited because they'd been writing about their languages. They'd been sharing their languages. They'd been writing dual language books in their languages in English. And they dragged me over and showed me not only what they had written, but what other children had written. And so what we're looking at here is not something that costs money. We're looking at a change in mindset, where we look at students' languages as resources to be activated rather than as problems to be resolved. One of the first examples of inspirational pedagogy that I came across in recent years was the work of Patricia Chow in Thornwood Public School in the Peel Board. I was involved with Dr. Sandra Schechter of York University in a project where we were working in Thornwood and another school called Floridale. And I won't go into the details of this, but Patricia got into the idea that dual language books were something that would be good to include in her classroom. She was one of the ESL teachers in the school. And she set up the dual language showcase, whereby students could not only read dual language books, but create dual language books. You can look at the languages. There's more. This is, I think, an older image, but there's probably about, I think, 19 languages that are showcased in the dual language showcase. There's student books written in English in their first language. And when new students come to the school, they can read books that are written in their language. Teachers can get an idea of how fluent they are in terms of their literacy skills. And this, again, didn't cost any money. This was just the mindset, the inspirational mindset of one particular teacher in this school. And this was the starting point for many of the pedagogical initiatives that have come since, not only here, but across the country. Another example is some images that I took one day on a walk through Crescenttown Public School in the Toronto Board. There was a group from a city in Italy that wanted to make a video showcasing multiculturalism as something positive. Paula suggested that they visit Crescenttown School, and I came along just as an onlooker. But you walk into the school, as you do in many schools in the Toronto Board, and the first thing you see are multilingual signs in the languages of the community. This, again, has minimal costs, but sends a powerful symbolic message to students and parents about the legitimacy of all languages. You go into the library in the school, and you see books in different languages that are represented in the community, and dual language books. The school, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but at that stage, the school used some of the additional funds it got from the Model Schools project to keep the library open between 4 and 7, 4 days a week, so that parents could come in, read books with their children, check out books to bring home with them. And this is exactly the kind of inference that one should be making, exactly the kind of initiative that should be happening much more widely if we were to really take account of the centrality of literacy engagement in students' academic achievement. You walk along the walls. They were, the day that I was there, it was during a period where the school was focusing on issues related to character development. And this student was talking about empathy, and he or she has done it in Spanish. And there's a definition of empathy in Spanish there. Another student has done it in Bengali, looking at fairness. You can't read this, but he says in English, fairness means, I can't read it either, so. But you get the idea, and it's in the student's first language. Now, the student probably was not literate enough in that language to write it himself, but he worked with his parents to do it. And again, that's parental involvement in an organic, powerful way. Another example from Robin Persad in the Peel Board, again in Thornwood more recently than the Dual Language Showcase. Robin did some amazing things, does some amazing things with the students. This is just one small example, but this is a grade 4 ESL class. And there was about 5 or 6 students from Arabic-speaking backgrounds in the class. And one of the things that Robin suggested that they do is look at the differences between English and Arabic. And if we look at the need for students, which all the research suggests, we need to get students to focus on language, become aware of how language works. This is exactly it. But it's doing it in a way that's affirming students' identity as speakers of Arabic. It's connecting to their lives. It probably gets them to discuss issues with their parents about their language. And both languages benefit from this. So when I'm talking about inspirational pedagogy, there's no shortage of examples around this city and across the country, as we've heard in this conference up to this point. But we're not, as I said, we're not talking about plowing huge resources into making this happen. This is a matter of choice, and all educators have the power of choice. And so regardless of the institutional constraints that we may be operating in, we've got individual and collective choices in how we interact with students, in how we engage them cognitively, in how we activate their prior knowledge, in how we use technology to amplify imagination, and how we involve parents in their children's education, in what we communicate to students regarding home language and culture. All of these things involve a change of mindset to go away from rigid adherence to curriculum guidelines and teaching, making sure that we cover all of them in a transmission mode, to thinking outside the box. How can we get students engaged? How can we connect to their lives? How can we honor the linguistic talents that they're bringing into the classroom? So what we're doing when we interact with students is we're inevitably constructing an image of the student. Like, to what extent is the image that our pedagogy, our instruction is constructing, one that positions the student as capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate? If you walk into the school and there's no examples of students' first languages around, if there are no first language books in the library, if the first language is treated with benign neglect, then the image of the student is not one of a student who's capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate. The school would probably be in English, effectively an English-only zone, despite the fact that we may have positive orientations and feelings towards students' first language. If English language learners never get the chance to engage in higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments, what image is that constructing? What message is that giving to them? You've got to learn English to a certain level before you can engage in critical thinking. The incredible work of Dr. Sunny Lau, who did her doctorate here in Noisy, and who's at this conference, shows very clearly that we can engage with students in a critical literacy process from the very earliest stages of their learning of English. And we can go on. Like, to what extent do students get the image, get the message that they're capable of creative and imaginative thinking, capable of creating literature and art, generating new knowledge, thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? If we can't point in our own practice to how this is happening with our English language learners, then we're probably not constructing an image of the student as a powerful learner. But this is something that we can change. We need to talk amongst ourselves. We need to think about what implicit assumptions are operating within our schools and in our own practice. Okay, just moving on to a second theme. The emergence of the distinction between BICS and CAL, basic interpersonal communicative skills or cognitive academic language proficiency. In English, that means conversational fluency versus academic knowledge. I remember when I first tried to make this distinction, and I'll give you some examples of where it came from. My boss at the time, Dr. David Stern, who was head of the Modern Language Center, shook his head and said, BICS and CALC will very likely come back to haunt you. Okay. Well, they're still around. They've been savaged by a lot of criticism from more conventional linguists and others, but they still resonate, I think, because they reflect a reality that has huge implications for policy. And there was two studies that I was involved in. They're both essentially no-cost studies that I was able to undertake. One of them was a study of more than 400 teacher referral forms and psychological assessments that I was able to do when I was out in Edmonton before coming to Toronto. At least I collected the data there. And then when I came to Toronto back in 78, 79, I was able to do a reanalysis of Toronto Board data on immigrant students' achievement. This was the Every Student Survey, and some interesting things came out of that. But let me just share with you the kinds of things that came out when I went on essentially a fishing expedition in terms of students' psychological assessments and referral forms. Because what came out was that students were picking up fluency in English very quickly. They were picking up phonology in English very quickly. But in many cases, they had not caught up to their peers in terms of their reading scores or other aspects of academic language proficiency. So here's a student that we gave the initials PR to. And he was referred in first grade by the school principal, who noted that he's experiencing considerable difficulty with grade 1 work. An intellectual assessment would help her, it's a female, would help her teacher to set realistic learning expectations for her and might provide some clues as to remedial assistance that might be offered. That's kind of boilerplate referral language. And then no mention was made in the referral form of the fact that the child was learning English as an additional language. This only emerged when the child was referred for the time by the second grade teacher the following year. So the psychologist didn't consider this as a possible factor in accounting for the discrepancy between a verbal IQ of 64 and a performance IQ of 108. So this is obviously a bright student with a nonverbal IQ of 108. She's way above average, but that's not reflected in her verbal academic skills. And the assessment report read as follows. Although overall ability level appears to be within the low average range, note the significant difference between verbal and nonverbal scores. It would appear that PR's development has not progressed at a normal rate, and consequently she is and will continue to experience much difficulty in school. Teachers' expectations at this time should be set accordingly. So the students' English communicative skills were presumably sufficiently well developed that the psychologist, and possibly also the teacher, wasn't alerted to the child's ESL background. So when we look at this, there were many examples of this in the referral forms. And it kind of came into focus for me a lot more clearly when I was able to reanalyze the data from the Toronto board. This is just one of the graphs looking at how long it takes students to catch up academically. LOR stands for length of residence. AOE down at the bottom is age on arrival. The piece of jargon over on the left-hand side is essentially standard deviation units. So there's 15 standard score points in equals 1 standard deviation. So if you look at students who've been in Canada for 1 year, they're about 1.5 to 2 standard deviations, so between 15 and 30 standard score points below grade expectations, below grade norm. This was a vocabulary measure. After 3 years of learning English, they're within a standard deviation, or about a standard deviation, 15 IQ type points below the mean. But it takes between 5 and 7 years before they're getting close, within a half standard deviation of grade norms. And so it was very clear what was happening in the psychological assessment data, because students were picking up everyday conversational English quickly. They were, when they arrived at a relatively young age, they were picking up native-like phonology in English. But it takes a lot longer to catch up academically. And clearly this has some major implications. It has the implication, as Fran Parkin and Felicity Sidnall said many years ago, that ESL is everybody's business. And so it's not just the job of the ESL teacher to teach ESL students. Okay? It's everybody's job.